Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
I guess I'll just say that the narrator is, he's introduced a little bit earlier. His name's Tom. He's an American that's wound up in France during World War I. And this section, which is kind of real close to the beginning, picks up in the years just after the war when he's working and living around the city Verdun. Verdun, 1921. Oh, and it mentioned, now there's all this stuff I'm realizing I did need to set up, but it's okay. This first name is not that important, but I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit as we get into it. Verdun, 1921. On the morning Sarah Hagen was to arrive, I awoke with the feeling of something crawling over me in the dark. A scrape of scale, a scratch of claw. I found Father Perrin in the courtyard, looking as though he hadn't slept either. He waited for me to wash and finish my bread and coffee, smoking cigarettes as if they offended him. He started the car and we left for the hills north of the city. It had taken years, but you could almost call Verdun a city again. In late 1919, the famous candied almond factory reopened and people began to creep back into the streets. A cafe opened, then a bakery, then a school. Well, that's French life for you, Father Perrin said. By 1921, the roads were clear, the bridges over the river rebuilt, the cathedral stitched with scaffolding. In the evenings, the sun reflected red in the new windows. In the hours just after dawn, there was a chalky light as if all the old cordite still hung in the air. I'd been to Aide de l'Evêque de Verdun for 2 years by then. My title sounded sophisticated, but my duties weren't especially. I helped the priests of the diocese with whatever they needed and was offered board and a small salary in exchange. Nonetheless, given Verdun's particular circumstances, it was an important job for which I was hardly qualified. Eventually, I learned to write better in French than I did in English. I often thought in French. I likely would have dreamt in French, but in my dreams no one ever spoke. On that day, we were headed to the Thiemont Ridge, to the village of Fleury, but there was no Fleury anymore, just as there was no Ornay, or Dumont, or Vaux, or Cumières, all villages leveled during the battle. The government had declared them officially destroyed. Though it seems that destruction is usually a matter of admission rather than fact, it probably was too dangerous to rebuild. Between February and December of 1916, 1,000 explosive shells had fallen on every square meter of ground that had been farmland and forest, then battlefield, then something new, known only as Zone Rouge. We crossed the snaking Meuse on a new bridge, the water below sleepy and dark, a few ripples, a few branches nodding just under the surface. The road wove up through hills. The mud remained in some places, but grass had returned in others, a bright, almost hallucinatory green. The earth has never seen anything like this, Father Perrin had said. We've confused it. I couldn't disagree. Much would be said about the battle's brutality, its exhausting length and strategic peculiarity. By the time it was waged, it often wasn't referred to as a battle at all. Will the Verdun affair ever end, the newspapers asked, using the preferred euphemism for catastrophe and scandal? Will the French ever recover from the Verdun affair, even if they do save the city? 5 years later, this still seemed an open question. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit and read one other just brief part.
Really good at this.
Oh, thank you.
I think you could read for longer if you want to, but...
No, I feel very encouraged, though, but... Yeah,
how good you are reading out loud.
I forgot what a talented shill you are. Okay, more World War I battlefield stuff now.
Literary writer,
yeah. Almost 1 million men had died or disappeared on the hills and fields northeast of Verdun, and their parents, siblings, and wives came in a steady line that might have stretched across the entire front. Ladies chauffeured by car from Paris, and illiterate shepherds from Languedoc, and marsh people from Finistère who hardly spoke French at all. The Father Perrin that appeared in the foyer of the Episcopal Palace to greet them was quite different from the man I knew. His expression a mixture of pity and nothing, a void into which they could pour everything they had to say. And though he said very little, though he let them make introductions and describe their journey, there was something in his manner, in the thin face that looked suddenly honest, the thin smile that looked suddenly kind, that suggested he was glad they had come. And that mere fact, that mere illusion, if that's what it was, meant the world to the family standing before him, many of whom had traveled for days in cramped train cars, or fuming motor cars, or sometimes in carts drawn by horses, or sometimes even by foot. Many of them had spent what little money they had to get here. For many of them, this was only one notch, perhaps the final notch in an absurdly long and lonely journey. They had already written letters to the lost man's lieutenant, to generals, to politicians, to Foch, Poincaré, and Clemenceau. They had waited for replies from their priest, their magistrate, their mayor, all the while knowing that a letter about their son or husband was just one of tens, hundreds, thousands awaiting its recipient, a letter to be responded to mechanically and in due time. Father Perrin would usher them through the sliding double doors into the office. He would offer to hang their coats on the square rack with its rectangular mirror, and he would offer them water from a glass pitcher I kept refilled, which rested on a wooden tray, which rested on a Second Empire side table. Yes, the dust still lingered, no matter how many times I swept out the room or beat the rugs, but if you could ignore it, you might not blame a father from Bayeux or a wife from Cassis for feeling they had been transported back into a time when the death of one man made some impression. That as they took their seats in the red cushioned chairs with their sloped and polished armrests, as they began to tell Father Perrin their story, they were no longer in a world of empty church towers, the bells melted for ammunition. When they looked upon Father Perrin and heard him say, "I'm glad you've come, I'll do anything I can to help you," they believed him. For some of these grieving families, Father Perrin had to say little else. For some, the sight of the churned earth, the rusted wire, the crumbling forts and twisted bunkers was enough. For some, the question that had coiled around them for months or years, how could this have happened to my son, my husband, my brother, began to make horrific sense. But many others didn't want to understand, they wanted to be understood. And they would lean across the Second Empire desk and clutch Father Perrin's hands. They would weep and talk for hours sometimes about the man they'd lost, as if all that talk might help us identify him, as if it might bring him back to life. Bring back to life the man from Poitou who'd walked to Paris as a boy to apprentice as a cabinet maker, who'd smuggled a young girl in a cabinet he carted back to his village. That young girl, now a woman, came to us in the spring of 1920 to describe every rut in the long road, every bump, the look in his eye when the door finally swung open. They wanted to bring back to life the boy from Anjou who killed a wolf with a bow and arrow and dragged him home across miles of fields. The boy's mother described his expression as he struggled to maintain the stoicism of his older brothers. She described her delight at seeing pride for the first time on her youngest son's face, even though she could also see it wasn't a wolf he'd shot, but a sheepdog. They wanted to bring back to the boy from Lourdes, who copied passages of Montaigne out by hand in his letters to his father to prove that he wasn't forgetting. The boy from Arles, who lost his right eye when he was 11, who'd saved money for a glass one to fool the draft board in 1915. They wanted to bring back the boy who picked apples in Normandy. His father brought a bottle of the family Calvados and insisted that Father Perrin and I drink until we could hardly stand. He made this, the father kept saying. He made this. I'll stop there. I hope that was under 5 minutes. I don't know.
That was perfect. What I would like for you to do or prepare is to summarize your novel for us, which is like the worst thing ever to be asked to do, but necessary. But I just want to say, so you think about that, that the structure of this book, which is like, you know, the narration, but also the amazing, seamless way in which you give the reader all of that information. It's so amazing, and I learned so much reading it, and at the same time, and I think, you know, that wonderful introduction you gave really sort of, you know, got at this point where you can lose yourself in the world and the characters, but as a writer, I was also thinking, oh my God, this is brilliant, the structure, and especially the lists of, because it is really like stories within stories, and so that was one of my favorite sections. I'm glad you read it. And now you have to tell us what your book is about.
Okay, well, so
It's hard.
My one sentence summary is that it's a love story that takes place in the aftermath of World War I. The slightly longer answer,
I've never had one.
How did I come up with something as great as that? The longer answer to that is that it's narrated by this guy named Tom, and Tom has come to France during World War I as a teenager because his father is works for this group called the American Field Service as a surgeon, and his father dies while he's there, and Tom ends up having this kind of peculiar life during the war where he's the sort of ward of the Diocese of Verdun, and after the war he stays on to help them, as it kind of says in that passage I read, as sort of their assistant, and they're doing two things that he in the beginning of the book is working on. The first is they are building this thing called the Dumont Ossuary, and an ossuary is a memorial usually made of or made to house bones. And the Battle of Verdun was this, that you probably know, this infamous World War I battle. It was a huge deal to the French, right? Like it's like D-Day and 9/11 and Pearl Harbor kind of like all wrapped into one. And after the war, there were thousands of unidentified bones, which they needed to do something with. And so they collected them over years and put them in this memorial they built. So that's one of his jobs. And also, as the passage that I just read suggested, it had become, and it still is to a certain extent, but especially in the years after World War I, it was this real place of pilgrimage. People were coming from all over France to either get closure about a loved one that had been lost, or in a lot of cases, kind of to desperately find out some information about someone that was declared missing instead of dead. So the kind of the plot of the book hinges around this person named Sarah Hagen who comes, who's an American like Tom, and even though it wouldn't normally be Tom's job to talk to somebody like her, he's kind of like the low man on the totem pole, and he doesn't really know how to do it very well, because she's a fellow American. This priest he works for asks him to talk to her, and he doesn't do a very good job, because he finds himself sort of attracted to her and lies to her, telling her that he actually knew her husband, who is missing. And that's kind of the sort of foundational event of the book, and it kind of develops from there, I guess.
Yeah, it's great. I still can't even do that for like my first book. And so let's talk about Tom, who's really a wonderful narrator, and it's a first person, as you can tell, it's a first person narrated book, but Nick has this really exceptional ability, it's rare, to then tell the stories of other characters, or even characters like just, the dead, the mysterious, with such imagination on the part of Tom. And it reminded me of one of my other favorite authors, Alice McDermott. And she does it, and it's like, I call it this omniscient first person, because really he's using his imagination. He has so much compassion that he is able to imagine the lives of these soldiers who are maybe not even real people, based on this, or even really at that location, based on the stories that were told to him. So my question is, did you always know that he was going to be the novel's guide, and that it would be told in that way through first? Because there are like certain challenges with having a first person narrator who doesn't, and he's also sort of an outsider, an American, an expatriate, he's young, like Nick said, the priests are sort of used to telling people, sort of comforting people, and like kind of taking confessions and hearing stories. But for him, I imagine it's very different.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually more interesting to write and read about people that are bad at their jobs than it is about people that are good at their jobs. Because conflict ensues, right? Yeah, I mean, I knew. I mean, I just kind of had, when I started working on this. Number one, even though it's a story about Europe, and particularly about France, I kind of knew that I needed an American to be central to it, and it would be it just would be easier and a little more truthful if it was told from the vantage point of an American, simply because that's my vantage point. So I was going, I did set out to what seemed, and in fact was pretty challenging, which was writing about something that took place 100 years ago. So I thought, like, well, at least I'll like try to keep like part of the point of view kind of in my discernible realm, and kind of write from an American's point of view. And also, I frankly figured that like the audience for this book is going to be American as well, primarily. So that would just be easier for American readers to kind of have this anchor in this foreign space, right? Like someone that kind of perceives things and kind of in the way that we're used to.
And there's the juxtaposition of the way in which the French who are coming and telling these stories, and like, it's a different story for them than it is for him. I mean, in many ways, but it is, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean it is. I mean, and that like one of the things that like suddenly I realized that was kind of a problem, especially once I began to learn about Verdun and just how sort of important from a sort of nationalistic point of view it is to the French. Right. It was kind of like, well, where are they going to let this American be wandering around doing this like sensitive work? And as it turns out, there actually is a good answer to that question. This Dumont ossuary was built with a little bit of government money, but mostly through private donations. Mm-hmm. And most of the donations were from Americans because they, at that time, were the ones that had the stable currency and had the money. So it actually, in a certain way, kind of made sense. They would have like a plant there to sort of like convince these kind of I don't know, the Astors or whoever, that this was something that concerned everybody, not just the French. So that's kind of how I ended up sort of justifying him actually being there. Right?
But so when you first started working on the book, he was there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about, so there's these sections that alternates, which I think you read. Did you read from both sections? No, you just read from the past section. So it alternates. There's sections where Tom is in the 1950s, living in Hollywood or somewhere near Hollywood. Actually, is he living in Santa Monica?
He lives in Santa Monica. I live right now. Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, this book was written for me. Which actually, I have to say that the experience I had reading this book, and it's when you're reading a really great book, is when it does kind of feel like you're so engaged and invested that it did kind of feel like it was written for me, even though I have no connection to World War I. Well, actually, sort of, but back far. But I don't know. I feel like also the post-war chaos of was really accurately depicted. So now I want to talk about research, because I feel like really it's just extraordinary, this seamless way that so much information is given to the reader, and yet I never even questioned why he was there, so you did your job really well. I wasn't like, wow, it's so strange that he's hanging out with all the priests in the fields of bones. I just accepted it, and it made sense to me. But so how much research did you do before you started writing the book? Like, what is your process in terms, because your first book, which it was good that it was published first, because that was the hardest book to hashtag. Because the title,
that was not an Instagram
was so long, and
this one used to have a much longer title too. They were
really?
like, cut that down. You got to get
And I remember every time I tweeted about Nick's first book, I was like, I was like, this is not even hashtagable. But now it would be like tragic. I can understand your publicist put her foot down.
Mm-hmm.
But research. So what is your because that book also, you had to do a lot of research. It was about the fishing community, like really intense fisherman stuff. So, and I actually was like, are you a fisherman? You're like, no.
We met in person. Clearly you are not.
Then I came and looked at your bookshelves, and I was like, maybe like a Hemingway-esque, like not chill fishing, like with
recreational, like fly fishing.
But to research, what is your process? Like, do you do a lot of research first? Or do you start writing?
So with this book, I guess I should say that why the way that I started writing this was I just heard a story on the radio one day. This was really long time ago now, probably back in 2009 or 2010. Back when life was simpler and there was a little more hope.
It really was.
And it was a story about this, about an anniversary ceremony commemorating the Battle of Verdun, and this is where I heard this one kind of detail about that this Dumont ossuary place existed, and that it was all these bones, as I already said, all these bones were there, and they were just picked up over many years by just a few people. And I just remember, I was like, that is crazy. Like, what if that was your day? That, like, you get up and, you go, like, walk around this field and you're just, like, picking up bones. All this, like, goes on for years at a time. Like, what does that do to you psychologically? And I thought that it was a really interesting window into the time, because, which is just a really interesting, they say, like, pity people that live in interesting times, or whatever the phrase is, right? That was a really interesting time to be alive, especially in Europe, because the world had, like, just kind of ended, the power structures that had been in place for hundreds of years had been toppled. There had been this cataclysmic conflict that where tens of millions of people died that was unimaginable and would have been, literally impossible on that scale even 25 years earlier. So there was, I think at that time there's this real sense of just kind of like terrible possibilities that people are sort of like, this could have happened if we could have just survived this. Like, what else is possible? And so you see that in this kind of interest in a lot of really irrational stuff, like in art and politics and spiritualism and all this kind of stuff.
Faith is a big track in the book as well.
And so I thought this one image was like a way to get into that. And I'm not that big into symbolism usually when I think about what I want to work on, but just the symbolism of someone whose job is to put all these pieces back that literally don't fit together anymore, right? So when I started writing this, that's all I had. I didn't really know much about World War I at the, I was like, I knew what it was.
Sort of.
But so I had a lot, and so not only did I not know much about what I was writing about, I didn't have any story either. It wasn't like that.
You had this sense of place.
I had this a sense of place and
character.
And well, but not even a character yet. I really had to. I had to like figure all that stuff out, which meant doing a lot of research. It meant reading a lot of books, which I did over many years. And one of the first things I did after I kind of committed to doing this project was I actually went to Verdun, and that was pretty weird. It's weird how much of it is still visible. Like when you go, the ground looks like this still. Like it's all the old shell holes and whatever. Just it looks like waves, and even now, annually, someone often dies who goes there, because they go there as a tourist and like pick up an unexploded grenade or a shell fragment or something, and it explodes in their hand. This actually, routinely is probably too strong a word, but it happens all the time. So that I think just. Seeing all of that, and then in the little passage I read, like they have all these little villages that were wiped away during the battle, that they were declared officially destroyed, and so you can go there now, and because it was too dangerous to rebuild them, because the ground is just like you couldn't run a plow in the ground anymore. These are old farming communities, but if you put a plow in the ground, it would kill whoever was piloting the plow, so they just had to leave them. They have them roped off, and you can see where there's a little plaque that says, here's where the butcher was, and here's where like the town hall was and stuff. But they're just roped off. So it's a very eerie place that they have very intentionally kind of done their best to leave it as it was, sort of, in part because they kind of had to, because it's really dangerous.
Wow. So when you went there, you knew that you had to write this book. Like, was there a moment where you were like, yes?
Well, I already bought a plane ticket to Europe, and I just felt like I was kind of committed at that point.
That's a good way to motivate.
Yeah.
I got to figure out what area I'm going to write about next that I want to visit.
Yeah.
So the way that you write about the destruction in this book is so, just it's through such specific details, which obviously, a lot of it must, is true to life, and I'm excited to read all the books and the acknowledgments that you said helped you do the research to write this book. So this is kind of a heavy question, but do you think humanity it's just part of our nature to destroy?
Whoa.
Or we could just get that question.
No, I mean...
Do you feel more optimistic about humanity after writing this book, or less?
Optimism is not really in my nature generally, I have to say.
I don't either.
Yeah.
Even though it was a very sweet sort of, there were moments in the book where the love and the compassion was really hopeful.
Well, I mean, those things, like, they all exist at the same time. Can I crack a smile once reading this? Is that possible, please? No, I mean, it is really dark subject matter, and I knew, the thing that attracted me about it initially was that it was really dark. And I didn't really think, number one, that I could handle working on something that was, that didn't. The number one is it would be false. I think that's not really the one's experience of life, even when things are really awful. And I've certainly never been in a situation like what these characters have been in. But even then, I think they're and maybe even especially that the compulsion to love and care is even more important. So there's this whole love story component of it that felt very necessary, just as far as keeping my own sanity. I didn't think there were actually that many readers out there that would want to just go 300 pages of just someone walking around thinking about grief and death, and as they scooped rotting bones into a bag. Maybe if Cormac McCarthy were writing that book, like that, you could pull that off. But more than that, though, that's just not the full measure of life, right? So I kind of went looking for ways to bring in just the other side of the coin, I guess, as it was.
Yeah. And so, have you been do you feel, so you started this book years before, I don't know about everybody else, thought Donald Trump would be, I feel like when we were sitting in your living room and you were like, yeah, I'm going to start working on this book about World War I wasn't like, Donald Trump is going to be president soon. So do you feel like, I'm sure you were maybe doing revisions after, final revisions after he had been elected, but also the way in which, our publishers sort of position our books or market them or talk about them, based on what's going on in current affairs. For me, my novel, The Gypsy Moth Summer, got extra attention because it's set on a fictional island that's a lot like Long Island, where there was a military aircraft factory and it's very conservative. So, I've seen reviews by readers that are like, this is just like real life right now, even though I wrote it, years before. So did that affect the way that you revised the book or thought about it, or the way in which you've had readers? I know it just, hasn't been out that long, but sort of the reactions that maybe you expect from readers. So I don't know if we really expect reactions. We're like, just like it.
I'm guessing most of the other people in this room right now, I'm not particularly pleased with a lot of what's happened in the last couple of years politically. But it has been interesting to see just how much of the sort of national political conversation has parallels a lot of the stuff I've been thinking about and writing about for the last several years. So that's true in a couple of different ways. and I certainly would not be the first person to draw comparisons between the 20s and the 30s in Europe and our current political moment in America. But one of the things that this book is really about is, at this time, this belief in the irrational, and in particular in things you want to be true but are not, right? And so one of the books, kind of to go back a little bit to your earlier question, when I started writing this, I really didn't know where it was going to go, and I really just learned what the plot was going to be as I researched. And kind of randomly one day I found this book in the Strand in New York that was a pretty slim book written in French and translated into English. I don't know how many copies were ever sold in America, probably not very many, but it was about this French soldier whose name was Anselme Margin, and he was a POW in Germany and was repatriated after World War I, and he showed up in a French, or I guess it was a train station in Paris without any papers, and unable to tell anyone who he was. And either he had lost his memory, or just didn't want to communicate, or some combination of the two things. And so he ended up in an asylum, and in an effort to try to figure out who this guy was, the doctors published his picture in the paper, and they got thousands of responses of people saying, "That's my son," or "That's my husband." And it's and the crazy, so obvious, and obviously there could only be one person who correctly identifies him, so just necessarily 99.9% of these were wrong. But not only were they wrong, there's no way they could have been right. And they even, in this book, print some of the letters that they sent, the person they lost was 6 inches taller than this guy, or had different colored eyes, or different, there was just no way it could have been him. And yet they would write these heartfelt letters saying, "It's him, I know it's him, and I've seen him, he came and told me in a dream it's him," and things like that. So that really was one of those things that really crystallized for me, just kind of what some of the spirit at the time was. And as far as, just this sort of intense grief and longing that people were feeling, but also this sense that just wanting something to be true could make it true, And there's a lot of that right now, right? This whole notion of the narrative that you want to be the right one, or that you see in your social media feed or whatever it is, as being the actual thing that one should believe in, is one real parallel. And the second half, that we haven't really talked about this much yet, but the second half of the book is actually about the rise of fascism in Italy. And again, that was kind of accidental when I started, because I wanted to set part of it in someplace other than France, because I just wanted to sort of offer a slightly more panoramic view of the time. And I just, I really like Italy, so I just thought, but mostly.
Did you visit there also?
Yeah. I spent a month in Bologna, where that part is really good food, and good wine. It was, I didn't really get much work done, frankly, when I was there, but it was very useful.
Many siestas.
Took a lot of it. Was like usually there, you siesta for 2 hours and are productive for the other part. I kind of reversed that, I think so. So point being, though, that I decided to set the second half of this, which actually has to do with this kind of amnesiac character that is based on the guy I was just describing, in Bologna. And I really had no idea. I started researching that once I made that choice, and I started realizing that Bologna was, at that exact time, was this real flashpoint for the rise of Italian fascism, and what kind of verged on almost civil war at certain points between Mussolini's black shirts, who were kind of his militiamen, and communists, socialists, social democrats, just about everyone else. And there was all these kind of violent struggles. And at first, and particularly right in Emilia-Romagna, which is the region that Bologna is in, and in the city itself. And at first I thought, oh, that's interesting. But then I kind of thought, oh, well, that's kind of, I need to write about that, actually, because that's the sort of omega point of this whole idea that drew me to the material in the first place, which is this kind of embrace of, or this kind of irrational. And Italian fascism is totally irrational.
Yeah.
They didn't have a platform. And he was very open about that. he would say, our platform is power. And people were like, okay, that sounds like a great, let's go with that, you know? So a lot of parallels there as well, right? I mean, and I think that way of thinking, of kind of, you know, of sort of leaving behind what you know is true versus what you want to be true, you know, has a lot to do with where Italian fascism sort of came from, and then ultimately, I mean, we all know where it led after that, right?
And I feel like it's also, you know, I mean, back to the destruction question, that was maybe not a good question, but because obviously the answer is yes. Humanity is addicted to destruction. But I feel like there is, you know, this, you know, there is so much faith in the book, whether it's, you know, there's that amazing scene with the, I can't remember what she's called, the medium.
The medium, yeah.
You know, I think just that desperation to believe in something, you know, it works so perfectly with this, you know, extremely post-destructive period. And reading all this stuff, I'm working on a book about post-World War II Italy and Southern Italy, and I was like, oh, this is so good for me right now. Thank you, Nick.
Julia.
I know, right? But it was really great. So one more question, a really quick question, and then I'm sure you guys look really smart and fun that you have questions. What was the original title? That's not my question, but I need to know now.
It was originally, for a long time, it was called The End of a Perfect Year.
Oh my God, yeah, no.
What? No, that's...
Actually, my first novel, Cutting Teeth, I had an end of the... It's the end of the world as we know it, and I can't believe my agent let me send the book out with that title, and that someone actually bought it. But yeah, I know. God, hashtags suck.
Yeah, suck.
So this is your second published novel, which is huge. Congratulations! It's so exciting.
Thank you.
I mean, really.
I am also excited.
You gotta remind yourself how awesome that is.
Mm-hmm.
So how was the experience writing this book different from the first one? Was it easier? Actually, maybe not. Easy should never be a word that we use when we talk about novel writing.
Yeah, it's, you know, it was. I mean, as you mentioned, the first novel I wrote, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of things that are different about this, because that one was more contemporary. It takes place in the peninsula and this kind of
And
fishing
there's
community.
copies for sale here.
There are, should you be interested. In a lot, and so I think like they kind of look different in it, you know, and like they're obviously about very different stuff, but they're not, in my view, that different as far as my approach, because in both cases it was about finding something I didn't know anything about, and an experience that kind of scared me a little bit, and trying to research and imagine my way into it. And so I didn't know when I started writing my first book that was part of my process as a writer, or like that's a useful thing for me. And I learned that writing my first novel, that I was much more comfortable writing about stuff that I hadn't directly experienced than I was about writing autobiographical kind of stuff. So then I thought, well, let's push it back 100 years and go to a different continent, and it's going to work even better, you know? Which you know, it's so
It'd be easy.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, and in some ways, there was a lot. There's, you know, it was really. I mean, I like history, obviously, so it was really fun, and just the scope of the research was really fun. Like, I was living in New York for the first couple of years I was working on this, and I used to go to that library, the famous one on 42nd Street with the lions out front, and you know, this may have changed now, because I know they have done a lot of renovation to that, but at least, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, you go into the Rose Reading Room, and there's like a window that like looks like a window that like a train station or something, and you give them the call number, and 20 minutes later this like dumb waiter just like comes up from this big subterranean vault, and there's these books there that don't have covers, and in a lot of cases, you know, I found some pretty obscure stuff that, you know, probably had not been we can't check them out, but had not been read in, or at least that particular copy had not been read in decades in some cases. And a lot of these were primary sources, so memoirs, letters, that kind of thing. And that was just like really fun to just kind of be sitting there in that room and kind of communing, for lack of a better word, with these people that had long since been dead, and these books that had not many people had read for a really long time, and just kind of this sort of like archaeology kind of feeling of that or something was really fun. And I ended up incorporating, you were kind of saying like stories within stories is a big part of how this book works, and a lot of that just comes from stuff that I kind of discovered that way, and it was kind of like, someone else needs to know about this, So that was really fun. The downside with writing more historical stuff, I've learned, is that the little details that you okay, there's a lamp on the table. Is it oil? Is it electric? Like, I don't know. What kind of shoe does somebody wear at that time and place? I don't know. If I need to, there's just little things you kind of take for granted to make the scene feel more lifelike or specific.
And there's no one that you can reach out to who's alive at that time. I mean, at least I have my father, who's like the worst storyteller. But I'm like, so what did it smell like in the cave when you were hiding from the bombs? And he's like, it was good.
It was good?
He's like, it was okay. It was okay. And I'm like, no, give me details. But I feel like, I just want to say a couple of things about how great the book is before we maybe have some questions from the audience. Obviously, immersing yourself in that research and those memoirs and those, the history really, everything in this book feels so incredibly believable to me. And I feel like readers will be able to escape and lose themselves in the way that it sounds like you did. And also like the mystery element, which we haven't talked about, there really is a momentum to this book as you're trying, as they're trying to figure out who is this man, this mysterious soldier, and yet it's like an extremely meaningful book on both a micro level within the love story and Tom's story of how really it's a coming of age story for him. He's kind of finding his purpose, which is so, important. And so basically everyone here should buy 3 copies. Because whoever you give this book to, they will love you for it. Seriously, they're going to be like, oh my God, remember that book? Remember the something affair? Because I'm not going to remember a French city name, probably. So does anyone, but really.
This is why I asked you to come.
This is why. I was at an event the other night and I was like, wait, I did maybe say that those were 2 of my favorite books of the summer. But this is too. I know you don't believe me. It's crazy that he doesn't believe me because really, this is an incredible book to be, and it was very inspiring. Right after I read it, I sat down and wrote, which, for writers, that's like, it was just so inspiring when you experience art, whether it's a book or a movie or something that, I can't say that what I wrote was good, but still. Does anyone have any questions?
I was really triggered by what you said about the seance and the rise of the occult, the interest in occult. So I started going through my mind of the empathy for storytelling residing in ghosts with Poe and Henry James, and then trying to carry that forward with futurism and cognitive dissonance with Pirandello. And I was trying to do the history all the way through up to hysterical realism, and how these events, these really traumatic historic events affect storytelling. Would you just riff on that a little bit, because you seem so interested in history, and I'm trying to think. I'm not a historian. I'm not really particularly interested in much beyond contemporary storytelling. I do know what's going on with technological and writers right now is a real thrust towards an unusual terrain. And you're making me think of all these other eras we've been through where people were writing stories, were innovating form, were going beyond invention to try to bring the emotion of the time through the history. Can you talk a little more on that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Let's see, what do I want to say about that?
Can you talk about the spiritualism of the book, like the seances and the...
Or anything,
Well-
just rip. I don't know.
Well, so one thing that kind of that comes to mind. I don't know. This is speaking directly to the kind of historical epochs that your question is talking about, but it's relevant in part just because of where we're sitting right now. Is that the frame of the book, as Julia mentioned, takes place in Hollywood, and that's not an accident. That's so much of what I wrote about is this whole idea of telling stories, but telling the version of the story that you want to believe in, right? And so, and all the characters in this book do that in a variety of ways, and the narrator is included in that. The whole thing, in a certain way, is the version of this story that he wants to believe in, right? That's true for any story anyone tells ever, right? And so, though most of it takes place in the 20s, the frame of it takes place in Hollywood in 1950, and he's become a screenwriter. And I made that choice because I kind of started thinking about, what, especially the kind of golden, studio system, Hollywood stuff. That's kind of the story, if there is such a thing as this, that's kind of the story that America wants to believe about itself, or at least like white Americans. So it seemed really like that was a kind of natural way in which some of those themes, like we live those themes in how we, anytime we and all of us here probably are lovers of narrative in all its various forms. But one of the things that I was interested in kind of getting at is kind of like thinking about like what are the selfish motivations behind those forms, or the rhetorical motivations, I guess, behind those forms. And when you start looking at pictures, the pictures of 40s, 30s, 50s Hollywood, and with that in mind, boy, there is this version of America that it's really, fighting with all their might to kind of sell you on, right?
Some of the movies that were mentioned, like Robin Hood, right? Wasn't it Robin Hood?
Well, yeah. So this amnesiac who they appear in, that they meet in Bologna. The staff at the hospital have nicknamed him Douglas Fairbanks, actually, right?
It's all very tied together. It's amazing.
Yeah, and Douglas Fairbanks, it was obviously this great silent film star. Also at the time in 1921, probably the single most famous American in the world, with the exception maybe of Woodrow Wilson, who everyone in Europe hated by that point. So I didn't figure they would name him back. So that just kind of thinking about it was interesting to think about all the ways in which just the services of storytelling, basically,
And it really makes sense that he would become a writer, and there's that great anecdote where Hemingway comes to see a Farewell to Arms made into a movie, and he doesn't really like it that much because they had to change it and make it more appealing to an American audience. And did you know that the Hollywood stuff was going to be in there from the beginning, or when did that come to you?
I didn't know that. That was probably the single. That was the frame of it was actually the last thing I wrote. So I'd written kind of the whole sort of 1920 story before I wrote the 1950s one, which is probably about 10% of the book. Because I didn't figure out until I had written it that was kind of the one of the big themes I was interested in.
Of course, it made me think of The Last Tycoon by Fitzgerald, and there are echoes of Fitzgerald in the book, the kind of narrator that he is, that sort of, even though he's much more present, I would say, than Nick Carraway, he has much more at stake. But there are those great moments of the observational writing where he's seeing and imagining characters that aren't actually physically present. It's really great.
So I have a process question. I'm not a writer, and don't want to be a writer, but I
Well, try it. You should try it. It's easy. Yeah, it's easy.
but it does seem very daunting. And I hear you say, you found out with your first book that you like writing about things you don't know. So I picture you get this idea based on hearing something, and now you do all this research, and you go and in my mind, you don't know what you don't know, but you grab a whole bunch of materials and you're reading, and I assume you're taking some set of notes of things that seem to be important facts. So then what's your process to make this thing come together? Because I've already given up.
Yeah. Sounds really hard.
It does sound really hard.
It is.
So first of all, I think even though you're not a writer yourself, I think that is a very sort of like wise question, because all the time, when you talk about, and I teach in an MFA program, and so we talk all the time about trying to find your voice. That's like the thing that a young writer has to do. But I actually think that just as important as that is finding your process, like figuring out how you actually work. And so that was part of finding mine. I found, and a lot of things really changed for me as far as my own work went once I did that. It's really unscientific, I have to say. And here's the true answer. Like, yes, I read a lot of things and write notes in the margin and keep a notebook with some stuff and whatever. But really, it's what I remember a month later, what I actually makes it in there, with a few exceptions. Like occasionally, I'll be like, oh gosh, I need something to happen here. I'll go do an old notebook and be like, oh yeah, all right, that would, But mostly it's just I kind of have like a sort of like HEPA filter or something like in my brain that it's just the stuff that I remember and keep thinking about is the stuff that it's just like kind of my. The stuff that sticks around is the stuff that stays in, basically, that I use.
It starts to get like a bigger ball of yarn, and the story starts, the pieces start kind of clumping together.
Yeah, it's a real mess in there. But I do think I don't know exactly what I believe as far as the model of the psyche or something, but I think there is definitely an unconscious or a subconscious or something, and I think that without that, writing would be really impossible.
Boring.
To
do.
Yeah, right.
You want to surprise yourself sometimes.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the interesting part, is when you're informed by reading all of the history and the anecdotes, and then something rises to the surface that you may have forgotten about, and it becomes like a pivotal, scene or plot point, I think.
For sure, and I think that if all you could do was actually write stuff that you had just kind of immediate access, that, I would never be able to keep that straight. Maybe other people who are smarter than me could, but you really, it's like that part of your brain that you don't know is working for you, doing the work for you, is what I find to be the most useful, and usually the best stuff comes from there too.
I think also that your process can change. I'm older than you are. I don't even know by how much, but enough. And now that I, run a business, have 2 children, I do a lot more thinking before I sit down and dedicate to a book. So I'll send myself one-line emails, a bunch of those a day, and then I'll just add them all to whatever document I have, and sometimes I'll have different documents for each character, because I often do the alternating third person. And I must have thousands of pages of notes that I never go back and look at because of because it's the act of writing them down or emailing them to yourself or reading them that informs you of the story that you need to tell. Yeah.
And do you force yourself to sit down for a certain period of time every day when you're ready to write?
It just, like Julia's saying.
Please say no.
Yeah.
That I don't force.
There are writers who do that.
So, a lot of times I could.
Do they have jobs?
It shows. life gets in the way, or other responsibilities get in the way a lot of actually, being able to do that. But it just depends on, if I'm actually in a mode where I have time, I think it's actually really useful to say, here's my word quota or something like that, because at least for me, no matter how good the day previous was, it's just like terrifying to write a sentence the next day. It doesn't matter. Just like the fear of
until you slip back in.
Well, yeah, but also like if you didn't have this, like it would be very easy not to slip back in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So playing some game with yourself where you have to do something or otherwise you hit yourself over the wrist with a ruler or something like that is that's useful. I don't actually hit myself with it. It's a scourge that I use. As a matter of fact, kind of a medieval sort of thing. But
I think that when we lived in New York, where I feel like we're surrounded by very young writers, like right out of MFA programs. I don't know how they're making a living and paying New York rent. But I remember having a panel. There was all Sackett Street instructors, which is the school I run in New York, and Nick used to teach for us. And they were all like, yes, I wake up in the morning, I go to yoga, I write my 1,500 words, and then all of a sudden I was like, God, I should be on this panel. Even though I was moderating it, I was like the failure on the panel. But I think that sometimes, like, when you're a writer, because I know you are a writer, I think everybody does it differently, and sometimes you can get so caught up in beating yourself up for not doing the daily thing that you just don't write at all. Because I work so much, running my business, like I'm a binge writer, so I do like Marriott getaways, when I was trying to finish this last book, where I go for like 3 days, like down the block, like down the street from my house, and just don't leave for like 3, which actually is very physically unhealthy. But you go to a place with your dramatized scenes where you're like, oh my God, I am in this book, but I think it's different for everybody. Don't do that, Madeline's gonna be mad at me now. And you're like, I'm going to the Marriott for the weekend.
She would never let me do that. She probably would be pretty sure I was having an affair if I said I was going to Marriott for a weekend.
Nick's wife is also a brilliant writer.
It's true. She's much better than me. I used to work for Julia when we lived in New York. She runs.
Did you both have an Iowa thing?
We both went to Iowa, but not
at
the same time.
Because I'm older.
Really? By like
I don't even
few
know.
months. I don't know.
Let's not talk about it.
Okay.
But and Nick was really he is still a great teacher, but he and his wife taught alternating nights in their apartment in Manhattan at a time when you guys were the only people teaching in Manhattan, because everybody who lived in Manhattan kept moving to Brooklyn. And I was like, God, But and then they left. It was sad.
It was sad. How much, Dylan, how are we doing?
No, we're not done yet. I'm just joking.
Okay.
No questions.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
So Nick, I'm interested in finding out more about your revision process, because this novel is really nice and compact at 300 pages. But did you have, like, say, a 500-page novel that you then had to pare down to 300, because you were talking about how fun the research process was, so were there any anecdotes or chapters that were outtakes in the end that are in your laptop somewhere that didn't make it in?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's got to be true for just about every book ever, right? But not, nothing. It wasn't never 500. I mean, I probably cut, maybe 50 to 75 pages, maybe, over the course of a few years of revisions, and then you cut some things and you write a little more, and that to fill in gaps that you've created or whatever. So, but yeah, it was hard because there was so much. I mean, there were so many other kind of little sort of sub stories that I was interested in telling that don't necessarily speak directly to the plot, right? So those were the things I had to be the most judicious with and the most kind of brutal with in editorial work. And a lot of that just ends up being, pacing. I think like there's. I think in at least I find in editing, like there are not, occasionally you'll just be like, oh, I don't need those 2 pages or something, but much more frequently it's like these 2 pages should be a page and a half or 1 page. You know, I mean, it's a lot of times it's just a question of. I used to a teacher I had at Iowa. You know, he always say one good thing to do when you're editing is try to cut a sentence from every paragraph. And in fact, when you try to do that, usually you can. So
Ethan.
that was Chris Offit, but he probably learned that from Ethan, or he very well might have.
Teacher
Yeah.
also.
Resume trying to keep it to 1 page.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a real kind of tyranny of pace. You know, I think in the marketplace, and just for people's attention spans for like a novel-length book. I think that there's a real kind of push to keep it moving as much as you can.
It's also great technique. I just want to say that that you're able to do all the lists in the book are such great to examine them as a writer and learn from them, the lists, what you read about the people coming and telling the stories about the soldiers who are the missing soldiers, really. So actually, if you in my copy, I started circling all the lists. Look, list. Because it's not that I'm good. That's me becoming a better writer by reading this book, because I was like, oh, look at this, it reminded me how useful that is, and because it really is a slim book for the amount of history and time, the time span also.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you really trying to kind of just the sort of boil down the stock kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But even up until my last draft of it, there was just and sometimes it's just a one sentence where it's just oh, that's such a cool detail. It doesn't do any. I love that, but it doesn't do anything for. It's just kind of weird that it's. I know it's there because I liked it and just wanted it to be there. It's not actually doing. This character has no reason to be thinking about this thing at this moment. I want you to know that I found this.
I want to share it with you.
Right. Here was just one example of that. I read this great book about rural France that I taught me a lot about rural France. And one of the things that I just thought was so cool was that that in some places one of the ways that they define space, you're in France, your little village, your país is, I don't know exactly how you say it, but P-A-Y-S is kind of the French word for your little village or your little space, right? And how do you know when that ends? When you're no longer in it, it's when you can't hear the church bell anymore. You can be out in the field and you can't. You've moved out of your home because you can't hear the church bell anymore. It's just a beautiful detail, right? And I just had this, but then it was
oh, you should not have taken that.
I did. The one place I could put that in, there was just no reason.
I'm stealing it from my novel.
Yeah, well,
definitely the same.
No, I already actually have it in my next one.
Except it's Kaizen.
What was the title? I can't
We're rewriting your book in the moment. No.
Right. So that was I kept that until the very. I knew that had to go years ago, but I just kept that until the very line edits I think that I was doing, and I was kind of okay, now that's gone. Yeah.
Now I have to dedicate my book to you.
I seriously, I have already put that in. Actually, the next one.
What are you working on now?
Other than that, it's about a church
At least you have
bell.
one detail. That's good. That's not hard.
I can't say anymore. It's about a very poignant church bell.
Usually the audience asks, "What's next, Nick?" But
They like the church bell idea.
Yeah. Well, can sort of anthropomorphize it a little bit, personify it. It's.
Not only what's next, but is it going to be 9 more years?
So I am working on another novel now, which it's similar vein, though. In part because a lot of it. On a more macro scale, a lot of the stuff that I kind of you just find all these other kind of ideas as you're researching. You kind of go, oh well, that X thing that would make a good novel. So. So yeah, I'm actually writing another sort of war-ish thing in Europe, but set a little bit later, and it has that church bell in it.
Italy? Italy?
It's mostly going to be in Eastern Europe, actually, I think, yeah. So I don't have a ton to say about it other than it better not take 9 years. And I am going to do my
First person?
damnedest.
You like the first
Yeah, so
person?
so the whole idea
Yes.
is this is going to be like first person, but even more removed. So like the first person narrator like really almost has nothing to do with the plot actually in this
Oh,
one.
that's going to be fun.
And,
Challenge
yeah.
for you.
It's gonna be a barrel of monkeys. Yeah.
So I thought that there was a somewhat of like a shell shock quality to the narration. And I was wondering if that was sort of if Tom's voice came sort of like pretty readily as you were writing, or if you were like, okay, I've really got to like find what is the right voice to tell a post-World War I story in like wrestling or something.
Yeah, well, so I'm curious, Dylan. When you say shell shocked, like what do you like?
Like there's like a coolness to it, but there's also to me it's I guess a result of like sort of feeling subdued but also grieving at the same time.
Mhm.
If that makes sense. So not like not like dazed and confused.
Yeah. So I mean, so I think part of that, right? I guess it's trying to do two things on a craft level. Like, I mean, it's retrospective, right? It's very obviously, or very self-consciously retrospective in the sense that Tom is in his 50s when he's telling this story, but he's telling it about a time in his life when he was in his 20s. So there is an inherent detachment to it, just because it's very self-consciously looking back in time. But and it's kind of supposed to take on the voice of a sort of older, more mature kind of person, someone almost Julia's age.
And yet, though, when we're in the dramatized scene, it feels like you're with the young Tom.
Well,
which is
right.
such
So,
a
but at the
awesome point of view technique accomplishment.
But I think you're right. Like he's not shell shocked really, but certainly like there is some like trauma and just kind of shaken quality to his life at the time. I mean, again, like his morning gets up in the goes out in the truck and picks up bones all day. Like
He watched his father die.
Yes, he saw his father die. Yeah. So
Not a spoiler, really.
yeah, that happens in the first page essentially. And I can't even say like here was a moment when I was thinking it just I guess basically to answer your question in the simplest way, like one of the things that did come pretty easily was the voice, and that's probably why I wrote it in the first person. To go back to one of your early questions, is because there's so much that does not come easily when you're working on a book, and you really should not look a gift horse in the mouth when you kind of find something. And even just that, first line of, I woke to something crawling over me in the dark or whatever, which was one of the first things I wrote, that I kind of almost, I had something at that point, and that's one of the good, when you don't question, even in some ways, like I think it would have made sense to write this in third person for a lot of other reasons, but I didn't question that.
There is a little bit, there is an element though, like a positive element, where sometimes I wouldn't even use the word unreliability, because even though there's the older Tom, who we assume is telling us the story, I felt like in the moments in Verdun, especially within the love story parts, right, that it did feel like you were with, and that's when you're with a skilled writer who can, because first person I think is harder than, it's more limiting. You only have one pair of eyes, one guide, and the fact that you can sort of show us you know, like how I talked about that omniscient point of view, that you can give us so much information that's outside anything that he would know using his mind. You're like a real first-person master, right? Don't even think about writing in third person.
That's my bad.
Never.
That's true. Yeah.
But it's really hard to do. I mean, I actually go into bookstores and ask them, I'm like, hey guys, and they're like, oh guys, Julia, she wants to talk about books again. And I'm like, do you have anything new in third person? And they're like they
like, no, actually.
because first person is really hard to pull off, like to do with like real grace and guide the reader and give a lot of information. So that's extra reason why you should buy this book. Seriously. Agree with me, Nick.
I was just pointing to you. I mean, that was the agreement gesture. Listen to her, yeah. We have time for maybe one more question, or
They might be sick of us.
Yeah.
You have a
Anything?
great sense of humor.
Only when he's with me.
I do have to
Question.
check it up a notch.
How early in conceiving the book did you come up with the love story as a kind of narrative book? And then, second question, maybe tougher, but maybe a dumb question, but do you find it tough to write those scenes, those love scenes, not the sex scenes, but the love scenes, because they've just been done so many times? And do you have a way that you approach those scenes in a way that you can make them your own?
Yeah, so to the easier part of the question, pretty early on. I mean, as I said, like I really was looking for. I mean, for all the reasons I kind of already sort of spoke about. Like it just felt like a love story was just a really appropriate way to kind of counterbalance all of the kind of macabre darkness of the material. I mean, just kind of really needed that, and there was a very kind of obvious mechanism for that to be a complicated sort of love story. To the second part of the question, yeah, it's really hard to you know, I mean, for better or for worse, like there's this part of a kind of like, you know, writerly training of like not being sentimental, like that's like the worst sin, you know, and being like cheesy or too obvious or cliche. I mean, those are all the things you're kind of trained not to really avoid. And so like, how do you avoid that but actually get something that is substantive on the page as far as a love story goes? And I mean, I think that I don't know to what extent. I mean, I think I did struggle with that, and I think the answer, you know, really just, I mean, this is the answer to like almost any problem in writing, is that like the more, it's all about specificity on the character level, right? So if you can, you know, have two very particular people that react and respond to each other in a very particular way, that feels to a certain extent controlled by the people or characters you have created, you begin to mitigate some of those eternal problems, I think, you know, because they don't feel imposed by like I'm trying to like pull the strings on like your heart in a really cheap way or something. It's like kind of them doing the work. But man, it's tough to get to that point though, you know.
I mean, I can tell you how he does it. So he uses really great choices of having Tom look at Sarah, right? In, you know, observation is very one note, but he interprets her gestures, you know, like the way she smells, the way she moves, in a way that implies so concretely, you know, the attraction. So I really think it is about specificity, but filtered through this great point of view technique, you know. I would say, and this is just me personally, and I've written about this topic, and actually got me into some not trouble, but a couple of years ago I was on a writing about sex panel here where everybody was like really confident, and I was on the panel also because I wrote this essay about how hard it is, because I feel like at Iowa when I was there wasn't one sex scene in workshop. And I think it really is like that. I know. It sounds like a really boring place. There's a lot of sex happening in Iowa. Just not at the MFA program on the page. Just between the students and the professors, maybe not now. Anyways.
Wait, was it just between the students and the
It's okay.
professors?
I graduated like 20 years ago, so. But I do feel like I've had to like almost like kill that voice inside of me that's like sentimentality, melodrama. Like I've seen students just berated by instructors who are, I'm just like, what's the point if you don't step right up to that edge where you're about to fall into sentimentality and melodrama as a writer? You won't know what it is that you're trying to show. You can always later in revision step back, but if you don't go there, and a lot of literary writers just don't go there, you know. I do, however. My book is for sale over there. There's a lot of sex in it. I know. Sometimes librarians are like, I hear your book is X-rated. I'm like, it's literary fiction. There's no X-rated.
But if
Maybe
there
I should
was.
start writing erotica. All right. Anyways, it's all about Nick. But it's true, the sentimentality thing, I think. But there's no sex without emotion. So maybe there has to be some sentimentality in sex scenes, right? I think it's about point of view. I know. I had to talk about this for like 2 hours.
How would there be sex without emotion?
But really?
But it's no conflict in a sex scene, right? Because both people want the same thing.
Well, that's simplifying it. Depends on those people.
Yeah. You must have a very happy
That would
marriage.
be a really boring sex scene.
I'm here with my parents.
I know. Yeah, are you kidding? This is a very tame discussion here.
Oh boy. Well, things have, like the turn we have taken here. I'm going to stay out. Yeah. Wow. Boy. Can we go back to talking about death, please? Anyone have any other questions about bones and mustard gas or anything?
Thank you so much to Skylight, and also please, there's a lot of Nick's book back there. Buy some copies. Authors live to sign your copies. You know, it's like basically the best thing ever.
It is indeed. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. Thanks to Skylight, thanks especially to Dylan, and thanks to everybody. Yeah. And thanks, of course, to Julia. Let's go to that scene.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.